Good morning. I am Bibi Hilton, Managing Director of an integrated communications agency here in London called Golin. We work for corporate consumer clients across all sectors, technology, healthcare, and a lot within food and drink and FMCG. So the communications challenge, I think Sharon touched on it a little bit with some of her up front, and I'm going to try and build out on that in a little bit more detail. But as we've heard from both Sharon and Sam this morning, the communications challenge is it's complex. There are many different stakeholders, audiences who are going to be impacted by you communicating and publishing this data. So it's a very general top-line view that I'm going to give this morning, because I think particularly in some of the larger organisations that have multiple different divisions and complex workforces, you can't possibly cover all of the detail you're going to need to go into from a comms strategy point of view in a kind of 15 minutes. So it's going to be quite general what I'm going to share, so please do ask lots of questions at the end. So as we've touched on, this is obviously, it's a very positive move reporting this, and I think Sharon said there is a very positive opportunity for many companies to shout about hopefully having a lower gap than maybe many of their peers within their industries or against the national average. But I think what we are going to see, certainly from what I've read, and I think Sharon echoed that, is that majority of companies are going to be around 18 and 19%, which is a significant gap, more in some industries, as has been touched on. So for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to focus more around the potential reputational risk and impact, and how you can try and mitigate against some of that and some of the things that organisations should be thinking about, rather than the more positive story, which equally I think there is a comms opportunity, and I'm very happy to talk about that as well. I think that as a general rule, when you're going to be sharing this data, it is complex, and there are lots of myths around what the gender pay gap is, what causes it, and I think that the kind of risk from a comms perspective, it's going to open up lots of questions, lots of concerns, potential confusion, kind of uncertainty from a manager perspective around what do I do with this data, how do I explain it? And so I think it's really important that you start planning now, because that communication, you want to be able to manage and mitigate that risk, rather than potentially, I think at a management level where people aren't clear on what the messaging is, to potentially add kind of fuel to that fire, rather than hopefully try and put it out and answer questions. So I'm just going to briefly touch on, I guess, what I think are the kind of key audiences to be communicating with. Internal is a big one. We're talking about organisations with 250 plus employees, and so I wouldn't underestimate the importance of focusing around how you communicate to that audience. Obviously, media, I mean, Daily Mail is obviously top of my mind this morning after everything yesterday. And I think as a corporate, you kind of have a fear of those kind of negative national headlines. But if you've got 250 plus people there, they're your best ambassador. And I think being able to kind of manage and help them understand what this data means, the action that you're taking, that's going to be a huge asset as you continue to report this annually. I think with employees, there's risk around confusion and anxiety, potential disaffection between men and women, and also at different levels. There's obviously a risk around legal claims, and I know that there's a little bit of scaremongering seems to be happening around potential claims being brought. And then at kind of a top level, leaders and managers, again, confusion and anxiety. You may be managing a huge team, but you don't necessarily have any experience in what the GPG is and how you're going to communicate it. And I think there's a big risk of inconsistency there. If you've got someone in a division communicating about this in one way, someone else in another way, that you can again risk this kind of confusion and mixed messaging. And obviously there's a reputational risk as well from kind of poor management and communication. External audiences, two really main groups here: institutional stakeholders. Risk here around a kind of loss of confidence in leadership on two levels. The first one is around, if your gap is huge, and then a perception that perhaps the leadership has not been addressing it. I think if you have been, as an organisation, maybe going out for a long time shouting about being, great place to work for women or great employer, and then it turns out your gap is actually huge, that's clearly a big, communication challenge that you're going to need to overcome and to proactively act on. And potential impact on share price, although I would say that's probably going to be in very, very extreme cases where inevitably there's probably some reputational challenges within that business as well. Media. The Daily Mail will be searching for the worst offenders, and they will be searching for hypocrisy because it is an easy article to write come April next year. So no matter where you might be trying to hide it away on your website, they will be out there and they will be looking for it. And as this starts to become, I guess, as we move towards April next year, the media will be starting to really focus on this, and they will be putting researchers on to looking for it. So don't think they won't be there. And I think particularly if you have been raising your head above the parapet and shouting about your employer brand, then whilst that is obviously great, all the work you've been doing, it does put you at more risk if your data seems to contradict that work. And this isn't my area of expertise, but I think that there is also some talk around firms going out there and actively trying to put together group claims, which clearly is a kind of risk on another side, but comms can play a role within that. So what do you do about it? The first one, I think, is to kind of think about the story. That's really where I would recommend starting. It's generally where we always start in communications. What's the story they're going to come up with, and how do we build our own story? Once you have your data or a sense of what your data is going to be, I think it's really important to look at how you contextualize it. So, is it good? If it's good, great. You're going to have a potential opportunity to tell a really positive story. But I think that's probably not going to be the case for the majority of organisations. Is it bad, or is it downright ugly, I guess, in some cases? How much does it compare in your industry? I think Sharon made a really good point in saying when you're kind of hearing the gap in a particular organisation is 39% sounds huge, but when it's contextualised and saying, well, actually, that's about average in financial services, that's kind of an interesting proof point because whilst it may be a lot higher than the national average, you can actually start to explain, well, actually, we're not out of sync. It's kind of common trends that we're seeing amongst my peer group. Obviously, contextualising is a big part of that is understanding the causes. That's really hard, but it's really important in terms of being able to communicate. And how does it fit with your wider employer reputation, which I touched on already. So it does need a lot of context. That's going to be key to the way you're going to communicate that, both reactively and proactively. You need to show some progress and some action. If you just put the number up with nothing around it and don't communicate that you're going to actually do something about it, that is going to place you at risk. In many cases where businesses have been reporting early, there could be an opportunity to already show some reduction, potentially. Are there already initiatives in place that are going to be built on as part of your action plan in order to tackle the gender pay gap? And what is the long-term plan to reduce it? Because I think we all know that there's no short-term fix to this. So when you're thinking about communicating internally and externally, you don't have to have the solution. It's not going to be like, right, we're really shocked about this data, but in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have done this and it's all going to be fine. I won't name them, but I was talking about this with a business leader the other day who said to me, it will be fine, I'm just going to give all the women a pay increase. And I said, well, that's lovely, that's great, I'm sure they'll all be really happy, but actually you're just going to see in another pay cycle the problem is going to be exacerbated. So again, it sort of highlights my point around some confusion and lack of understanding, but also I think it's fine from a comms perspective to talk about the challenge, recognise the challenge and lay out your long-term plan. People will respect you for that and understand that it is a complex issue. And then the third part of it is about sharing your plan. So when, where and how are you going to communicate? I think most companies will probably leave it towards April next year, but there can be some advantage to publishing early, particularly if you have got a good, robust story to tell. There's a lot around who's going to actually be the communicator and to which groups. Is it always the CEO? Does that make sense? What's their reputation like within the industry and around some of these issues? Is that appropriate? And how are you going to actually engage those different audiences when you communicate? understanding the causes, I think that's probably been covered quite a lot by Sam and also Sharon this morning, but I think if you aren't in a position where you've started to develop a comms plan, that's clearly the first place to start, because the story you're going to tell and the key messages are going to be based around those causes. And once you understand the causes, you can start to put your plan in place. And I've just listed out some of them there, which I'm sure you are all very familiar with and have been touched on. Starting to change the culture. So like I said, simply sharing the data, that one number, is not going to be enough from a comms perspective and to manage that reputational risk. So once you understand the causes, obviously working out that plan and what parts of that plan you feel comfortable communicating, I guess, to those different audiences. Not all of it may be appropriate to communicate immediately with internal audiences or with external stakeholders. So there'll probably be another kind of layer to that plan where you might communicate you have put in place a longer term plan, but not necessarily all of the detail that goes with that all in one go. And I think that, as I said before, those that don't communicate there is a long-term plan are going to be more vulnerable to reputational attack unless you're in a position where you have a very small gap and have been doing a lot of changes to your working practices over the past few years. There's a lot of detail on this slide. I don't know how readable that is from at the back, but I imagine we're going to share the slides afterwards. So I just tried to do a very top-line view on our perspective on the key audiences and how and when you might communicate. This is by no means, this is a very broad general template, and clearly every business is very different. So starting at a leadership manager level, obviously communication there probably goes without saying, needs to be proactive and very inclusive communication. Communicating to that group will no doubt come from a very senior CEO or very senior HR level. I think the key messages for this particular manager level: explaining what the gap is and the causes that have been identified within that, the training provision that's going to be in place for them as managers having to manage this kind of at the coalface, but also for the employees that they manage. And engaging them very much in the problem. So whilst they're part of the solution, I guess, in implementing those new working practices, they also need to be very much engaged in the problem and very supportive of that plan. So the tone of communication there needs to be very collaborative, soliciting support, and very action-oriented. And I think you would want to start communicating with that level now, if you haven't already, so that they feel very much included and are able to start implementing that plan and starting to push out some of those messages to your wider internal audiences. Then in terms of wider employees, again, I think that communication needs to be very proactive and it needs to be done early. The last thing you want is your employee base to be reading about the gender pay gap in the Daily Mail before you've talked to them about it. And again, particularly if it is a large gap. And you want them to be feeling positive about the steps that you're taking to reduce that. So again, it depends on your business, depends on the size as to who is going to communicate that. Whether it ends up being more of the manager of the different teams or units actually communicating that, you need to ensure that the teams see that this is being driven and supported at the highest possible level within the business, even if that individual is not necessarily doing the direct communication. It depends on the scale of your business. Messages for this group very similar to the leadership level. They probably don't need all the detail on the long-term plan because that can open up more questions, more confusion, particularly around their kind of individual career paths and opportunities. I think you want to also focus on existing work that you have hopefully been doing. Otherwise, I think there can be a risk from an employee perspective that people who've been working there a long time suddenly discover there's a huge gender pay gap. The kind of confusion and risk, well, how does this fit with me and my role? Have I been underpaid for a significant amount of time? What have you been doing as a leadership team about that? And you obviously don't want to undermine that confidence. Human, open, talking about it very much from a kind of personal level rather than just throwing lots of data at them is really important. And you want to make sure you do this well before you publish. And regular ongoing communication with that group as well. So not we're just communicating it now and then don't talk to them about it for another year. From a media perspective, I've put reactive communication because I think my sense is that most organisations who are going to have quite a gap are probably not going to want to proactively shout about this. But there are going to be, hopefully, lots of exceptions to that rule. And it really depends on how your kind of employer reputation in terms of best practice in the workplace, and how big your gap is, and how that fits with maybe other corporate social responsibility work that you're doing. But I would say the majority probably will be a reactive point of view. That doesn't necessarily mean that the difference between when you're going to publish, it's just that in terms of how you're going to engage media about it, will probably be more on a reactive basis than going out and shouting about it. In terms of who communicates around that, likely a head of communications, could be a CEO, could be a leadership person. Again, it really depends on your particular organisational strategy. Or it may be that you create someone to be your spokesperson around this, or you have someone who's already your spokesperson around diversity or initiatives around women in your organisation. You want to put together a kind of bank of assets that are ready to go, and I'll talk about some of that in a bit more detail. So pre-drafted media quotes ready to respond to some of the inevitable questions, explaining your gap, the causes of it, what you've already been doing and what your plan is for the future. Transparency is key with this. If you're not transparent, they will find it out anyway. They will start interviewing your employees. So it's important to be upfront about that. And that links back to another fact that is so important to have dealt with this with the employees and communicated clearly to them, because if media try to start speaking to them, that we experience on several clients when we're dealing with these kinds of issues, you don't want that to counteract what you're communicating publicly. And probably with media it will be from April onwards, or whenever the date is that you're going to be publishing. And then the final group is institutional stakeholders. So that is going to again be proactive communication. Whoever is handling your investor relations or a kind of CEO level, there it's very much about reassuring that you have control over this data, that there isn't reputational risk, it's not going to affect the share price, and reassuring them that you are tackling this, that you are doing something about it, which hopefully they are already aware of that. And again, that group needs to be engaged well ahead of you publishing anything externally, which probably goes without saying. Putting together a kind of toolkit, there will be a lot more detail that will go into this, but at the top line, you probably want to create some consistent guidelines for communication internally for leadership and managers to make sure everyone's on the same page. You want to create a timeline for how you're going to communicate to those different audiences so that it can be carefully managed at stages. A key messaging document that covers all of those kind of key points that I just talked about. And I probably would advise that you nominate someone to be a credible spokesperson for this issue. Now that could be an existing spokesperson in the organisation, so could be a CEO. If you don't feel that your CEO or business leader or head of HR is appropriate to be the spokesperson for this, it could be worth just finding a different person within the organisation. The reason I say that is that it's probably advisable that you choose a woman to speak about this issue. It doesn't play out well in the media, particularly if you feel that you're going to be challenged reputation on this issue, to have a kind of older male spokesperson at a leadership level, because they just won't have as much credibility to be able to talk about this issue and perhaps bring some of that more personal kind of emotional background to talk about some of the issues that have caused that problem and how you're going to be tackling them. So that would just be advice that I would give my clients from a PR perspective. If your CEO, has been out there talking about these issues for a long time and has a lot of credibility, then gender doesn't really matter. But I just think it's important to look at the kind of prism within or the lens within which you're talking about some of these issues. And then just briefly, Sam asked me to do a bit of a case study around who I thought had handled corporate comms very well recently, and when faced with an issue, and who had done it incredibly badly. So this is a rather blunt case study, because I'm sure you're very intimately familiar with Sports Direct's handling of their recent issues. But I'm using this more just to really make a point. So workers' rights is at the top of the agenda in terms of media from an employment perspective at the moment. Sports Direct have been absolutely eviscerated in the media, quite rightly, recently. But interestingly, ASOS and their logistics partner, a company called XPO, have been facing some of the same challenges, which you may be less aware of. They have also had some very, very challenging headlines. But the two companies have handled those kind of challenges around the same issues around workers' rights, working big warehouse organisations in a very, very different way. So I was just going to kind of use this as a rather blunt example of how you can do it well and do it not so well. So this is a quote which I'll read out from the ASOS spokesperson in response to some of these allegations around poor working practices. There have been a number of allegations about the working conditions at our warehouse in Barnsley that are inaccurate, misleading, or based on out-of-date information. This upsets us, but more importantly, it upsets the people who work there. Those who seek to portray the warehouse as an awful place to work never mention the positive work we do, the 50 different learning and development programs we offer, free mental health support and awareness training, subsidised food, or the 3 million we spent on a cooling system to keep the temperature down. On the other hand, here's just, it would have taken all morning to cover the material that is available on this, but a couple of quotes from Mike Ashley in response to some of the allegations levelled at his organisation in the Select Committee on his plan to end sexual harassment in his workplace. He said, "Simple as that, fellas, not just fellas, girls, sorry." He said that he would work to change the unfair practices in his business, but said, "I'm not Father Christmas, I'm not saying I can make the world wonderful." So tonally, very different, and just kind of broad brush stroke really to make a point. The communication from a Sports Direct perspective has been incredibly opaque, very aggressive, very defensive, very flippant, in some cases quite childish. No clear coordinated plan or strategy, a very inappropriate, ill-trained spokesperson in the form of their CEO, and reacting to the story rather than controlling it. They lost 57% off the share price, huge reputational impact. They've now become the poster child for unethical working practices, and I'm sure we all saw the Select Committee on TV. ASOS, on the other hand, have faced similar challenges, but have had a much more transparent, factual and open way of communicating. They talk about, as you saw in that quote, the action they're already taking. They communicated in a more empathetic way. We're upset about this problem. We recognise it's a problem, but we are sad about it and we want to change it. Much clearer communications, professional trained spokesperson who isn't even named, so it's less about the person and the individual, but about dealing with the media's questions and controlling the story. And their share price has actually gone up over the same period that they have been facing these allegations. And from the research that we've done, no real material impact. They did have a Select Committee yesterday, so they're not out of the woods. But this is more about a different way that you can communicate some of this. So I'm not trying to scare anyone with that example. That is a very, very extreme example, but really to make the point that you can get out ahead of this and control how you communicate around the data. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bibi. That was really illuminative, I think. Lots of food for thought. Has anyone got any specific questions for Bibi? Because she can't stay for the panel session later, so it is your chance to ask her any particular questions you might have. I've got a couple. I just might just...
go on.
So, just going back to your point about talking to your staff first, because I think that I can completely see the sense in that, but I think the risk with that is that you're not then in control of the story. So you tell your story, you say, well, you know, really sorry guys, we've got this problem, but you know, don't worry, we're going to do this, this and this. And then somebody in the room goes, oh my God, you know, this is terrible. I always knew this place was a bad place to work. Yeah, they've got a grump already, and they then go and do something with that. What do you do about that?
So I think with employees, it needs to be a phased communication. So I think you want to start by telling them, well, that you're going to report the data. I mean, you have to anyway, but telling them that you are going to be doing that, explaining to them what it is, what the causes are, the work that you're doing, and that needs to be a phased communication running up to when you're actually going to publish. Now, what you rightly outline can happen even at the point when you've actually published the data. I think that you're going to win more support and more positive reaction from your employees if you trust them and talk to them about it ahead of that data going public. I think when you work for an organisation, you don't want to be reading about that in the media the next day. You want to feel that you've been trusted with that information, and you want them to be bought into the programme that you're going to be implementing. So that is always a risk, but I think it comes down to the kind of tone and the way that you communicate that to them. I think it can go the other way. If you just publish and you talk to external audiences first and don't engage internally, that same scenario is probably likely to play out, and I think it's probably more likely than if you trusted them and brought them along the journey with you beforehand.
So there's a lot about organisational culture already then, isn't
yeah.
it? So it's what sort of relationship do you have with your staff in the first place? Yeah. Is a good point. Yeah. And you know, and I think the point you made about them being ambassadors for the organisation is a really important one. Yeah. Not thinking of them as sort of somehow this being done to them, but they're very much part of the story that's being told. And
that's why I think I deliberately pulled out manager level versus the kind of more mass employee base, because I think that that's why it's so important that the managers who have those more intimate kind of one-on-one relationships with the employees really understand this, and they really feel trusted and they feel very clear on the messaging, because I think otherwise that's where you open up more risk when there's kind of inconsistency and, all right, well, this team have been told that, you know, it's all fine and we're doing that, and that team, you know, and your example around teams with different gender balances, I think that that's where you can also get a lot of confusion as well. So,
and just one more for me, then I'll go back to the floor. Is there any organisations coming to you for consultancy advice purely on internal comms issues, or do you mostly deal with external facing comms issues? What's your...
No, we have lots of clients we do internal communications for, both.
Yeah, it is a really significant thing.
Yeah.
Okay, has anyone got any follow-up questions? They've had a bit of time to think. I just think this is a really important and fascinating part of the story. With it, if you look at all the official guidance and everything else that's available, it is neglected, I have to say. They haven't really spotted that this is where people are going to have to really focus a lot of time and effort, and all the reputational issues. So I think it's one that certainly as Fawcett we want to do more work on ourselves, because I think we've got to meet this really head on, which is why I was really pleased Bibi could be here and talk about it from sort of an agency perspective.
One thing I forgot to say is also media train your spokesperson. Which is picking the right spokesperson, but also making sure that if they can handle Today programme or whatever it's going to be.
Yeah, exactly. Brilliant. Okay, I think that is really almost taking us up to the next session. So if you need to shoot off, Bibi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really great to have you here.